Have you ever felt like you're stuck between a prayer and its answer? Like you've done everything right, shown up, believed, stayed faithful, and yet nothing's moving? You're not alone. Some of the greatest spiritual growth happens not in action, but in the waiting. What if the silence isn't punishment? What if it's preparation? What if right now God is working behind the scenes in ways far beyond your understanding? We live in a world obsessed with speed. Faster is better. Instant results are praised. Waiting is seen as weakness. But God doesn't operate on our clocks. His timing isn't delayed, it's divine. And sometimes the greatest work He does in us happens while we wait. Not when the doors swing open, not when the breakthrough comes, but in the stillness, in the tension, in the space between the seed being planted and the fruit appearing. It's hard to wait when you feel like nothing's happening. Maybe you've been praying for a breakthrough in your health, a relationship, a job, a dream, and the longer it takes, the more the doubt creeps in. You start to ask questions like, did I hear God wrong, or is He even listening? Or worse, is something wrong with me? But waiting isn't proof of failure. It's the arena of faith. It's the place where trust is tested and refined. Throughout the Bible, waiting is not a punishment, it's a process. Joseph waited years in prison for a crime he didn't commit before being elevated to leadership. David was anointed king as a teenager, but didn't sit on the throne until years later. Abraham waited decades for the child God promised. Even Jesus waited in silence for 30 years before his public ministry began. Time wasn't wasted in those waiting periods. It was sacred. It was the forge where character, humility, and trust were born. We don't like slow seasons because they confront our need for control. But the truth is, we often learn more in the pause than in the pace. When everything is quiet, we begin to hear ourselves more clearly. And in that honesty, God begins to gently reshape us, not just preparing the blessing for us, but preparing us for the blessing. It's not that God is stalling, it's that He's strategic. He sees the full picture, while we see only the frame in front of us. What we interpret as delay may actually be His mercy, keeping us from stepping into something we're not ready to carry, or preparing someone else to meet us at the right time, or aligning circumstances we're not even aware of yet. God is not idle, He's intentional. So what do you do while you wait? You root deeper. You pray even when it feels like whispers are bouncing off the ceiling. You keep doing the last thing God asked you to do. You worship, not because everything is perfect, but because He is still good. And you trust, not because it feels easy, but because He's proven time and again that He is faithful, even in the silence. Waiting isn't empty, it's holy. And the longer you're in it, the more you realize it's in the waiting that your soul learns how to hold peace without having control. It's in the waiting that grace becomes enough. And it's in the waiting that you realize you're not being punished. You're being positioned. There's something disorienting about waiting without answers. You wake up each day hoping for movement, praying for a sign, looking for some confirmation that God is still listening. But instead, the same silence lingers. The same prayers echo back. The same circumstances remain unchanged. And in that stillness, it's easy to feel forgotten. Easy to question if you've done something wrong. Easy to wonder if faith really matters. Waiting has a way of amplifying every insecurity and doubt, but not all silence is absence. Sometimes silence is sacred. Sometimes God speaks the loudest in what feels like nothing. There's a quiet work being done in the hidden places, even when you don't see it. Just because God hasn't answered the way you expected doesn't mean He hasn't heard you. His delays are not denials. His pace is not neglect. It's intention. It's protection. It's preparation. You may feel like nothing's moving, but heaven is never still. God is aligning pieces you don't yet see. He's softening hearts you haven't met. He's closing doors that would have hurt you. He's growing you in ways you wouldn't choose but will one day thank Him for. Because what's being formed in you during the wait is just as important as what you're waiting for. Patience, resilience, trust, these aren't spiritual accessories. They're essentials. And they're rarely formed in comfort. When you stop fighting the season you're in and start leaning into it, you begin to change. You become less obsessed with outcomes and more aware of God's presence. You start to see the beauty in what's being built slowly. You begin to trust that what you're becoming matters more than what you're receiving. The wait isn't about passivity, it's about transformation. The Israelites waited 40 years in the wilderness, not because God wasn't able to deliver them, but because they weren't ready to carry the promise. Waiting revealed their idols, tested their faith, and shaped their dependence. And even when they grumbled, God fed them. Even when they disobeyed, He stayed. The wilderness wasn't punishment, it was training. It was God's mercy disguised as delay. Maybe that's true for you too. Maybe this season that feels dry is actually sacred ground. Maybe the hunger you feel is not a sign of lack, but an invitation to a deeper feast. Maybe the thing you think you need most isn't the breakthrough, but the intimacy with God that the waiting has produced. Sometimes the wait isn't just about what God is doing around you, it's about what He's doing in you. You don't have to love the wait to learn from it. You don't have to feel peaceful to be growing. You just have to remain. Keep showing up. Keep praying, even when it's quiet. Keep trusting, even when it's hard, because God honors the faith that stays. Not because of reward, but because of relationship. The wait exposes what we truly believe, and if we choose to believe in His goodness, even when life doesn't make sense, we are building something eternal inside us. Grace doesn't speed things up. It strengthens you to walk at God's pace. It reminds you that you're not being punished, you're being prepared. And the longer you wait, the deeper your roots grow. You start to realize that delayed dreams don't mean dead dreams, that the time in between is not wasted, it's foundational. God isn't just writing your story, He's developing your character to carry it. So if you're weary, if you're doubting, if you're tempted to give up, breathe. Be still. You don't have to rush to prove your faith. Just stay and trust that even in this seemingly unmoving space, something holy is taking place. Something deep. Something lasting. Something worth the wait. There comes a point in every season of waiting when your strength begins to fade. At first, you're optimistic. You believe with confidence, you pray with energy, you tell yourself that the answer is coming soon. But as days turn to weeks and weeks to months, or even years, that early fire can grow dim. Hope can start to feel like a distant concept, like something you once held tightly, but now only remember faintly. And in that space, it's easy to start wondering if any of it mattered. It's in these slow stretches of time that your faith is tested most deeply. Not in the spectacular moments of breakthrough, but in the ordinary hours where nothing changes. This is where trust becomes more than a word. It becomes a choice. A daily, often silent act of surrender. Not a dramatic leap, but a quiet, steady walk. A decision to believe even when nothing seems to be happening. To keep praying, not because you feel powerful, but because you know God is still present. What no one tells you about waiting is that it often strips away everything else. Distractions, comforts, assumptions, until all you're left with is the question, is God still good when life isn't? And that's where grace does its quiet work. It meets you right in that tension, not with loud answers, but with gentle reminders. That even if the circumstances haven't changed, you're still being held. That even if you can't see the outcome, He still sees you. The people who walk closest with God are not always those with the most spiritual gifts or the most visible success. They're often the ones who have learned to walk slowly, to endure quietly, and to trust deeply. They've waited for healing that didn't come in the way they expected. They've experienced loss that never made sense. And still, they've stayed close. Not because they had perfect faith, but because they learned to lean into grace. There is a strength that's born only in delay. It's not flashy or loud, it's not the kind of strength that makes headlines, but it's the kind that lasts, the kind that carries others, the kind that steadies your own heart when fear wants to take over. And the only way to receive it is to walk through the waiting without walking away. Sometimes God doesn't show us what's next, because we're still being shaped by what is. Our character is still softening. Our motives are still aligning. Our identity is still being anchored, not in what we do or what we get, but in who He is. And that anchoring can't be rushed. It's deep work, soul work, the kind that only happens when everything else is quiet enough for us to listen. It's tempting to think that movement means progress, but spiritual growth doesn't always look like forward motion. Sometimes it looks like stillness. Sometimes it looks like tears on a pillow and whispered prayers in the dark. Sometimes it looks like simply getting up and facing the day again. And in those small acts of faithfulness, something begins to change, not always around you, but within you. Waiting reshapes the heart. It teaches you what really matters. It exposes the places where you've tried to control, to manipulate, to rush, and it invites you to let go. Not of your hope, but of your timeline. Because God is never late, even when He's silent. He is never idle, even when you can't feel Him. His pace may be different than yours, but His purpose is perfect. You might not see the fruit yet, you might still feel stuck in the in-between, but don't lose heart. Don't believe the lie that nothing is happening. The soil you're standing in is holy. The roots are growing deeper, and one day, you'll look back and realize that the wait wasn't a delay in your destiny. It was the very path that led you there. It's strange how waiting can make time feel both heavy and hollow at the same time. The days stretch on, yet somehow blend into each other, leaving you with the sense that life is passing but nothing is moving. You check for signs, any signs, that the breakthrough is near. A conversation, a change, a hint that God is shifting things in your favor. But sometimes all you get is another sunrise that looks exactly like the one before. Another moment where you're forced to choose, will I trust God again today, even when I see no evidence of change? This space between what was and what's next is where so many people give up. Not because they don't love God, but because they expected the story to move faster. But what if the delay is not an interruption to your story, but a crucial chapter of it? What if the slow unfolding is not God being late, but God being intentional? The Bible doesn't promise a quick resolution to every prayer, but it does promise that God is faithful in every season. Think of Noah, who waited over a year in the ark without a clear idea of when he would step back onto dry ground. Or Hannah, who cried out for years before her prayer for a child was answered. Or Jesus himself, who spent 30 hidden years preparing for just 3 years of public ministry. In every case, the waiting wasn't wasted. It was holy preparation, and it shaped the very power of their witness. You might not realize it now, but the way you carry yourself in this season matters. Waiting well doesn't mean pretending to be okay. It means showing up with what you have, even if all you have is 5 loaves and 2 fish. It means being honest with your weariness while still choosing to worship. It means planting seeds of faith, even when it feels like drought. It's not about perfection. It's about perseverance. Sometimes we look at others who seem to have received their breakthroughs and feel like we've been overlooked. But comparison will always lie to you. It will tell you that God plays favorites, that your prayers are weaker, that your journey is off track. None of that is true. God is not pacing His faithfulness based on someone else's clock. He knows the intricacies of your story, your needs, your capacity. What looks like delay is often divine design. There are things you're learning right now that you couldn't learn any other way. Patience forged in the fire of longing, trust shaped in the silence of unanswered prayers, humility born from the awareness that you can't make things happen on your own. These are not small lessons. They're foundations. They're what will hold you when the blessing comes. Because what's the point of stepping into your next season if your heart isn't ready to carry it? Waiting exposes your attachments. It reveals where your hope really lies. If your joy is only tied to outcomes, then waiting will always feel like a threat. But if your joy is rooted in God's presence, then waiting becomes an invitation. A daily return to the truth that He is enough, even now, even here, even without the answer. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to feel the weight of waiting. But don't let it convince you that God has gone quiet on you. Every moment in the wilderness is counted. Every tear is seen, every sigh is heard, and behind the scenes there is movement. You just may not see it yet. Grace is not always visible, but it is always working. So if you're still in the place where nothing seems to be shifting, don't give up. Lean in, press in, let your trust deepen in the stillness. One day the doors will open. One day the wait will end, and you'll walk forward not just with an answer, but with a heart that's been formed in the presence of the one who never stopped working. When the waiting stretches on longer than you expected, it begins to change your inner world. What once felt like hope now feels like endurance. What once stirred excitement now requires discipline just to keep believing. You keep praying, but the silence grows heavier. You keep serving, but the weariness creeps in. You try to stay faithful, but a part of you wonders, has God forgotten me? This is the tension of long obedience. Not the kind that gets celebrated or applauded, but the quiet kind that happens behind the scenes. It's the quiet yes when everything in you wants to give up. The daily decision to believe, not because your circumstances inspire confidence, but because you've come to know the character of God. That kind of faith doesn't come from being constantly affirmed. It comes from walking through seasons where you have to trust without tangible results. There's a spiritual maturity that only develops through sustained waiting. The kind that presses deeper than surface-level positivity and leads you into gritty, honest faith. You learn to lean on what you know when what you feel is uncertain. You learn to worship, not because your life is in perfect order, but because your heart refuses to let go of God's goodness. And in the background, even when you can't sense it, God is moving. He's arranging the invisible. He's strengthening what's hidden. He's preparing you in ways that don't feel like preparation. What if the delay isn't a detour, but the very road you're meant to travel? What if this waiting room isn't a mistake, but the exact place where heaven is teaching you endurance, shaping your discernment, and forming your identity? You're not being overlooked. You're being refined. And there's no shortcut to refinement. Gold isn't made valuable because it looks good. It becomes valuable because it's been through fire. The fire doesn't destroy it. It reveals what's pure. That's what God is doing with your faith. Removing what's shallow, deepening what's real, teaching you how to stand firm when the wind blows hardest. Sometimes you'll look around and it will feel like others are being blessed while you're being benched. But God doesn't work on comparison. He works on calling. And your calling has its own rhythm, its own timing, its own season. If you measure your life by someone else's harvest, you'll miss the sacredness of your own planting season. This isn't a time to rush. It's a time to root. God is asking you to trust Him more deeply, but with the process. To trust that even your tears are watering something, that even your unanswered prayers are not ignored, that even the silence is speaking something profound. Faith is not built on clarity, it's built on commitment. You may not see the fruit yet, but that doesn't mean the ground is barren. What you sow now in patience, prayer, and presence will bloom in a time that only God can determine. Your job is not to control the harvest. Your role is to remain faithful in the soil He's placed you in. So keep sowing love where you feel unseen. Keep praying when the heavens seem closed. Keep trusting when you don't know what's next. Because one day, perhaps without warning, you'll wake up and see that what you waited for wasn't just a result, it was a revelation. A deeper sense of who God is, a stronger understanding of who you are, and a life that reflects His grace, not just in victory, but in every moment you chose to keep going. There's a moment in every waiting season when the noise around you fades, and you're left with the quiet truth that this is no longer about getting what you want. It's about becoming who God has been shaping you to be. You begin to realize that the breakthrough, as beautiful as it might be, is not the only miracle. The real miracle is that you're still here, still believing, still choosing trust in the middle of so much uncertainty. This is the place where grace deepens, not because it changes your situation, but because it holds you in it. The kind of grace that doesn't just get you through the day, but transforms how you see the day. The kind of grace that softens you when bitterness wants to harden you, that gives you vision when weariness clouds your sight, that teaches you that the waiting itself is not a void, but a vessel. It's here that God does something sacred. He rewrites your definition of strength. Strength no longer looks like control or results. It begins to look like surrender, like open hands instead of clenched fists, like saying, even if this doesn't change, I still trust you. That kind of surrender isn't weakness. It's the deepest kind of courage. It's faith matured in silence. It's trust refined in stillness. In this stillness, the things that used to define you begin to fall away. Your identity is no longer tied to what you produce, how fast you progress, or how visibly things move. It becomes anchored in something more eternal, God's unchanging love for you. You're no longer chasing affirmation from outcomes. You're living from the truth that you are already chosen, already seen, already loved. And while nothing around you may seem different, something inside you shifts. You become less anxious about the timing and more attentive to the present. You start to notice the grace in small things, a quiet sunrise, a friend's unexpected encouragement, the peace that shows up in moments you didn't expect. You begin to live less on adrenaline and more on awareness. You're no longer waiting to start living until the answer comes. You're living now in the middle, because grace made that possible. Sometimes what God wants to give you through the waiting is not what you asked for. It's what you truly needed. Maybe you asked for resolution, but He gave you resilience. Maybe you wanted release, but He gave you revelation. Maybe you hoped for a miracle, and instead He gave you maturity. These are not lesser gifts. They're the foundation for every promise that will follow. There's something unshakable being formed in your soul. The kind of faith that doesn't crumble when plans fall through. The kind of joy that's not dependent on circumstances. The kind of peace that can stand still even in storms. And none of that comes easily. It comes through staying, through abiding, through trusting when you have every reason not to. The longer you wait, the more clearly you begin to see that God is not only after the outcome, He's after your heart. And sometimes He uses the waiting to heal places in you that you didn't know were broken, to restore parts of you that success would have skipped, to bring clarity you couldn't see in the rush. He's doing more than you think in ways you can't yet comprehend. You are not stuck. You are being shaped. There is movement happening in the unseen. There is purpose even in the pause. What you call delay, God may be calling development. And while you may be longing for answers, He is offering you something even deeper, Himself. The wait may not end today. The breakthrough may not come tomorrow, but you are not wasting your time. You are being refined by grace. And when the promise finally arrives, you won't just be someone who receives it. You'll be someone who's ready for it. Someone who's lived the truth that God is faithful, not just in the fulfillment, but all the way through the wait. There's a point in the waiting when you start to wonder, not just when the breakthrough will come, but whether it was ever meant for you at all. Doubt doesn't always arrive like a storm. It often comes slowly, disguised as logic, caution, or realism. It whispers, maybe this just isn't your story. Maybe others are called to miracles, but not you. And those whispers can be louder than silence. They can make you shrink back, settle, or even stop hoping altogether. That's when grace becomes your lifeline, not as a feeling, but as a choice to believe again. Grace doesn't erase disappointment. It carries you through it. It gives you the courage to hope again when your heart has grown weary. It teaches you that even disappointment has a place in your story, and that God isn't afraid of your frustration or your questions. He welcomes them. He sits with them. He listens. And in that holy space between pain and peace, something sacred is built. Trust not based on outcomes, but on relationship. The world doesn't know what to do with people who wait with hope. It celebrates speed, control, and results. But grace forms a different kind of strength, quiet, patient, and steady. It teaches you to live from a deeper place, not from adrenaline or urgency, but from trust. And in that trust, your soul begins to breathe again. You're no longer pushing for a finish line. You're walking with the one who wrote your path. God is not waiting for your faith to be perfect before He moves. He's just inviting you to remain open, to believe again, even when belief feels fragile, to take the next small step, not because you're sure of the outcome, but because you know He's with you. Faith is not the absence of doubt, it's choosing to move forward in the presence of it. That's where grace lives. Sometimes we expect the wait to be filled with clarity, but what we get instead is a call to trust without answers. And strangely, that's where the transformation happens. You begin to realize that you don't need to understand everything to experience peace. That certainty is not the prerequisite for stability. You begin to live by what's eternal, not what's visible. And you start to notice that even without resolution, you are changing. You're becoming more grounded, less reactive, more at ease in your own soul. The strength built in waiting isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself, but it reveals itself when life shakes you and you find you're still standing, when disappointment doesn't drive you to despair, when silence no longer feels like punishment. That's the quiet miracle of grace. It teaches you to stay soft while the world tries to harden you. It gives you resilience that doesn't depend on results. You may still long for the promise, you may still ache for the answer, but you've started to realize that the process itself is shaping you in ways the promise never could. You're no longer the same person who began this journey. You've been humbled, you've been deepened. You've found a kind of joy that isn't rooted in circumstance, but in the unchanging love of a faithful God. There will always be tension between what we see and what we hope for. That tension is holy. It keeps us leaning in, it keeps us asking, seeking, knocking, and in that persistent posture, God does more than we realize. He weaves purpose into the silence. He prepares strength for the next step. He teaches us to carry hope, not because life is predictable, but because He is. So if you're somewhere between the promise and the fulfillment, hold fast, not just to the outcome, but to the one who walks with you in every unseen moment. You're not behind. You're not forgotten. You're being formed, and the longer you stay rooted in grace, the more unshakable you become, even here, especially here. Waiting can feel like a wilderness, a dry, uncharted place with no landmarks to measure your progress and no signposts to tell you how much farther you have to go. There's something about prolonged uncertainty that makes you question everything, not just your direction, but even your sense of identity. You begin to ask, am I still who I thought I was? Has this delay changed me for the worse? But the truth is, the wilderness isn't where you lose yourself. It's where you discover who you really are, and more importantly, who God has always been. The beauty of grace is that it doesn't rush you through the wilderness. It walks with you in it. Step by step, thought by thought, tear by tear. It's not a map that promises shortcuts. It's a companion that promises presence. It doesn't guarantee that the wait will end soon, but it does guarantee you won't be alone 1 second of it. That promise, more than any answer or resolution, is what begins to change your relationship with the waiting itself. Eventually, the goal of the wait shifts. You stop trying to escape discomfort and start trying to listen through it. You begin to ask new questions, not when will this be over, but what is God revealing here? Not how long do I have to endure, but who am I becoming in this? Those questions open up a kind of spiritual clarity that can't be found in busy seasons. They pull you out of survival mode and into deeper awareness. Grace begins to take root when you accept that the delay isn't a punishment. It's a platform for growth, for healing, for revelation. Sometimes the very thing that feels like it's holding you back is actually setting the stage for what's next. There's work being done in your heart that success could never accomplish. Things like humility, compassion, dependence. These virtues aren't often learned in abundance. They're forged in the unseen spaces. And grace teaches you that you don't have to be in a rush to be in the right place. You don't have to hurry to catch up. You're not behind, you're not missing your moment. Because grace doesn't operate on pressure. It operates on presence. And presence is always right on time. You begin to reframe the narrative in your mind. Instead of calling this a delay, you start calling it an invitation. An invitation to trust, to pause, to recenter, to peel back the layers of fear and performance and let yourself rest in the truth that God's love isn't waiting for you to reach a milestone. It's right here, undiminished, unconditional, unmoving. It's easy to believe that waiting is wasted time. But what if these are the days you'll look back on as the ones that changed you most? Not because of anything spectacular, but because of what happened inside you. Because you stayed when it was hard. Because you kept showing up in faith when nothing made sense. Because you chose intimacy with God over certainty from Him. Even in the quiet, grace is speaking. Even in the questions, grace is answering in ways words cannot. Even in your exhaustion, grace is sustaining you breath by breath. You don't have to figure it all out. You just have to be willing to keep walking, even when the path feels hidden. There's a purpose in the process, a reason in the rhythm, and a promise in the pause. You may not see it now, but the deeper work of grace is often hidden until the right moment. Then suddenly what once felt like wilderness becomes testimony. What once felt like silence becomes song. And what once felt like waiting becomes the space where you met God more closely than you ever had before. There's a shift that happens in your heart when you realize the waiting isn't something you're simply enduring. It's something God is using. What once felt like delay begins to feel like design. What once felt like silence starts to feel like strategy. You begin to sense, deep in your spirit, that this isn't a story of being overlooked. It's a story of being prepared. And while it may not make the wait easier, it does give the pain a sense of purpose. It reminds you that your life is not stuck, it's being shaped. And one of the most beautiful transformations that happens in the waiting is how it turns you into a witness. Not of perfect strength or ideal faith, but of endurance, of grace, of what it looks like to walk through seasons of ambiguity and still remain faithful, to choose joy without having all the answers, to show up in the midst of uncertainty and say, I'm still here, I still believe. You may not realize it, but your story is already becoming someone else's survival guide. Your honesty, your struggle, your choosing to keep going, that speaks louder than 1,000 sermons. There is power in your process, not just for you, but for the people who are watching, listening, and wondering if it's possible to keep trusting when nothing seems to be changing. We live in a world that values finished products, highlight reels, clean endings, but God does some of His most sacred work in the messy middle. And that's where you are right now. Not lost, not failing, but right in the middle of your becoming. Grace lives in that middle. It's where strength is quiet but unshakable, where hope feels fragile but somehow endures, where your roots grow deeper even as your branches wait to bloom. There is a witness being formed in your life, not of what you've accomplished, but of what you've survived. And that witness matters. Because others will see the way you stayed soft when bitterness would have been easier. They'll see how you kept moving when it would have made sense to quit. They'll see how you found joy in the in-between, not because your circumstances changed, but because your heart did. That's the kind of testimony that lasts. Not the one built on perfection, but the one built on perseverance. The kind that says, I didn't always feel strong, but grace never let me go. The kind that admits the questions, the doubts, the wrestle, and still ends in praise. That's what makes your story holy. That's what turns the waiting into worship. You don't have to wait until everything is resolved to speak life. You don't have to hide your process until it's polished. You don't have to pretend to have it all figured out. Grace invites you to be real. And that authenticity is what breathes life into others. It gives them permission to be honest. It shows them that God is present not just in the miracle, but in the mess. One day, you'll look back and realize that the greatest thing produced in this waiting wasn't the outcome you hoped for. It was the person you became. A person more rooted, more compassionate, more aware of God's quiet nearness. A person who no longer needs perfect clarity to have peace. A person who can say, even here, even now, I've seen the faithfulness of God. So don't despise your process. Don't discount your journey just because it doesn't look the way you imagined. This season is sacred. This ground is holy. And this moment, this decision to keep trusting is a testimony in motion. Even if you don't feel it yet, grace is building something eternal in you. And that kind of transformation doesn't just change your life. It lights the path for others too. Waiting rarely ends with a grand finale. Often it ends quietly. Not with fireworks or fanfare, but with a shift in the atmosphere, a moment that feels like the answer was there all along. Sometimes the breakthrough is loud, obvious, undeniable, but more often it arrives with peace, a calm in your soul that didn't come from the resolution itself, but from what you discovered in the tension. And in that moment, you realize the real miracle wasn't the thing you were waiting for. It was the person you became in the process. You've learned things that can't be taught in a classroom or read in a book. You've learned what it means to stay when it would have been easier to run. You've learned what it means to pray without results, to worship without guarantees, to trust without clarity. These are not just traits of faith, they are the fruit of it. And now they live in you, not just as beliefs, but as muscle memory. Your soul has been stretched, your roots have gone deeper, your peace has matured. You may not be the same person who started this journey, and that's a good thing. Because the old you was still learning how to release control, how to rest in God's presence, how to stop tying worth to outcomes. The old you might have seen the wait as punishment, but now you know it was formation. You weren't being overlooked, you were being overhauled, rebuilt from the inside out. Your vision cleared, your trust deepened, your purpose refined. That doesn't mean the waiting was easy. You had moments of doubt, days you didn't want to get up, prayers that felt like they bounced off the ceiling, but you kept going. Not perfectly, but persistently. You kept walking through the fog, guided by a faith that refused to quit. And that kind of endurance, that's grace in motion. That's faith in action. That's what it looks like to walk by faith and not by sight. Sometimes we think that the goal is to get through hard seasons as fast as possible. But what if the goal is simply to become someone who's unshaken by them? What if the gift wasn't the thing you were asking for, but the intimacy you found with God while you waited? What if the waiting wasn't wasted at all, but woven into the very fabric of your destiny? God never wastes a season. Not a single tear, not a single unanswered prayer, not a single night you sat in silence and whispered, "I trust you anyway." Those moments weren't filler, they were foundation, and they will hold you for the rest of your life. Because you didn't just wait, you waited well. And that kind of faith leaves a mark on your story, on your relationships, on the world. You don't have to fully understand how God worked to be thankful that He did. You just have to pause and look back with open eyes and a quiet heart. You'll start to notice the moments that didn't seem significant at the time, but now feel sacred. The prayers that didn't get answered how you expected, but led to better outcomes than you imagined. The delays that once hurt, but now look like protection. This is what it means to walk with grace. To let God lead even when it doesn't make sense. To trust that He is good, not just because He delivers you from the wait, but because He was with you in it. Always present, always working, always faithful. So now, as this chapter closes, you carry more than just hope. You carry wisdom. You carry resilience. You carry the presence of God that sustained you every step of the way. And no matter what comes next, you can rest in this. The same grace that carried you through the wait will guide you into whatever's ahead. If this message brought light into your waiting season, consider joining our growing community. Subscribe to Think Fresh Daily for more grounded, honest, and faith-filled content that helps you walk through life's real struggles with unwavering hope. You're never alone here. You are seen, you are loved, and you belong.